Hello Zero Books readers and viewers, it's me again, Douglas Lane, and this video will deliver yet another critique of what is calling itself the post-left. Or if that's too broad a category, then it is a critique of Michael Lind and his idea that a managerial elite is dominating society. Along the way, I'll explain how the history of secularization led to Marx's critique of political economy, why the notion of social class or caste must be considered separately from the idea of class as it relates to capitalist production, and I'll take an excerpt from Ben Burgess's upcoming book, Canceling Comedians as the World Burns, an effort to demonstrate that it's possible to oppose the progressive or left liberal wing of capitalism without becoming a neoconservative with a Marxist aesthetic. In a previous video, I explained why the concept of the left was still relevant today, despite the fact that the US left had largely liquidated itself into the Democratic Party. In this video, I want to argue that a class-based politics based on a Marxist understanding of political economy is still relevant today, and to clarify the difference between the Marxist conception of class and other forms of supposedly class-based politics that confuse older forms of social organization for today's society dominated by capital. The political difference between the old feudal systems of social organization and bourgeois society might best be understood as the difference between autocracy and democracy. Autocratic systems of political authority have the aim of serving the interests of the rulers, whereas democracies aim at serving the interests of a citizenry that is conceived of as consisting of equals. In the Middle Ages, the interests of the rulers were thought to be the legitimate interests of society as a whole, as the purpose of society was not to meet the needs or desires of people on earth, but to meet the demands and needs of divine authority. Within the autocracies of the Middle Ages, the ultimate ruler or sovereign was God up in heaven. Bourgeois society, the world that arrived through a series of breaks from autocratic regimes, brought with it a process of secularization. The old forms of religious authority were dismantled, if only partially. In philosophy courses, the beginning of this period of secularization is often called the Age of Reason. In a couple of mentor philosophers' books entitled The Age of Reason and The Age of Enlightenment, this period is defined by such figures as Galileo, Descartes, Spinoza, John Locke, David Hume, and George Berkeley. But the process of secularization has been long, and it's remained incomplete. In the 18th century, a figure like Hume cleared the way for modern secular society by undermining justifications for religious beliefs. He argued against miracles, refuted the cosmological argument for the existence of God, and noted that what originally motivated religious beliefs were man's fears of a cruel world and his ignorance of the ultimate cause of his misery. By the 19th and 20th centuries, those who were struggling against religion attempted to point out the more hidden causes of religious belief.
The title of my first lecture is The Masters of Suspicion. The three great masters of suspicion of the 19th century, and it's not merely their intellectual work that began to make us feel estranged and alienated and separated from the holy world of previous times, the world in which we could find our meaning in God. At first, you will notice only the negative part. In other words, the destructive part of the criticisms. As long as we could believe with Descartes that if we knew something clearly and distinctly, we knew it, we were okay. But then when the suspicion crept in from the direction of Freud that we could know something, but it would really be a forbidden piece of our sexual history, prohibited and thus channeled in another direction, that was bobbling out of our little lips. I think any one of these theories can be taken too far. But it's clearly the case that the field of the unconscious undercuts religion in a very important way, gives a very profound explanation of it. In the case of Marx, what's being masked is economic interest.
In the Mentor Philosophers series, these masters of suspicion are examined in a book entitled The Age of Ideology. And that book begins with Kant, because the difference between the ages, between the age of reason and the age of ideology, can be found by examining the difference between two Copernican revolutions. The Copernican revolution that Galileo championed shifted our understanding of the outside universe, whereas in the late 18th century, Kant's version of the Copernican revolution shifted our understanding of our own minds. Rather than our understanding, our perceptions being shaped by objects outside of us, the world as it appears is shaped by our mental character. Kant produced a critique of pure reason, a critique of the idea that there was an objective rationality that was common to all rational animals. As Henry Aiken put it in The Age of Ideology, from the time of Kant on, the assumption of a preordained correspondence between the mind and its object was regarded as dogmatic and uncritical. The reason in things is the same as the reason which we acknowledge as a standard of valid thinking about any object. This is only because we ourselves have preordained what conditions any object must meet if it is to be counted by us as real. By the middle of the 19th century, our own participation in the construction of reality had taken yet another turn, a turn back to objectivity that was nonetheless not a reversion or a simple reversal. So when Aiken describes Marx, he starts with a familiar quote: "Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world. The point is to change it." If we take a post-Kantian view, then we can see that what Marx is saying is that philosophers, including Kant, Hegel, and their followers, have only tried to interpret and explain the subjective categories of understanding that are necessary for the world as it is to appear. But the point is to change the conditions that create those categories and to change the world that springs from them. For Marx, this required more than finding the right ideas, the correct presuppositions that would create a better world. And it required much more than merely abandoning long-standing dogmas and religious notions. He wanted to change the material conditions that created society. In the German ideology, Marx makes it clear that critiquing the ideas of society, abandoning dogmas, will not be sufficient. He compares the young Hegelian critics of ideology to a valiant fellow who had the idea that men were drowned in water only because they were possessed with the idea of gravity, and who believed that if they were to knock this notion of gravity out of their heads, say by stating it to be a superstition, a religious concept, they would be sublimely protected against any danger from water. For Marx, what presents itself as an ideology, or as a religious conception of reality, is in fact a justification for a real material relation. The world, while not separate from our conceptions, was nonetheless objective. In fact, it was only because our objective relation to the world had already been established that any conception of the world, and therefore any appearance of it, could arrive. Engels explained Marx's perspective this way: Marx discovered the law of the development of human history, the simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing, before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc. What's more, Marx argued that because of the way our productive relations had changed, that is, the way we provide ourselves with drink, food, shelter, and clothing, it had changed. We now have a clearer conception of the truth of both the objective world and our relationship to it. While the feudal period may have been justified in terms of serving the needs of a divine order, it too had in fact had worldly aims, namely the social reproduction of its own material needs. However, it was only after bourgeois society took hold, after the creation of a legally free laboring class, that the material reality, the class basis of all societies, was laid bare. Now, all of this explanation is leading up to this. The difference between an understanding of society based on caste or social class and a Marxist understanding of society is this difference between what Marx called the German ideology, or idealism, and materialism. In his book, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, Ben Burgess wrote, "There is a cluster of left pathologies that includes everything from the revival of tanky attitudes to hysteria about minor political differences within the left, to the bad habit of framing disparities between different groups, primarily in terms of introspective psychodrama about unearned privilege, as if the absence of oppression were something that had to be earned. There are good arguments against all of these things in principle, but what I'm most concerned to show in what follows is that they're all symptoms of the failure of the contemporary left to think strategically instead of turning politics into a moral performance." Burgess rejects turning politics into a moral performance because he believes that the struggle for political change cannot be reduced to a question of moral authority, but rather that power resides elsewhere, in the way labor is organized, for instance, in the way goods are distributed, and then in the institutions of power and authority that try to manage the chaos of capitalist society. The assumptions of those who point to social class distinctions or caste distinctions in an effort to explain political or economic reality is different. They assume that power rests precisely upon moral performance. They believe that the power of one or another sovereign authority imposes norms and standards that ultimately shape reality. Marx, on the other hand, points out that the working class, a propertyless class with little to no social authority, ultimately creates both the real wealth and the abstract value that dictates the terms of society, including the superstructural norms and values that appear in a fractured and multifaceted way in society. Today, most everyone behaves as a young Hegelian or as a German ideologist. That is, most everyone has reverted to this idealist posture. Cancel culture warriors who want to stamp out every bad thought expressed online, neo-populists who want to fight neo-Marxism and defend Western civilization, and everyone in between seems to believe that what rules society are not the material and social relations around production, but political ideologies, moral power, and the fragmented grifts and rackets that pop up here and there online. The primary concern of most everyone is the distribution of power and wealth, as if the stuff of the world is presumed to exist on its own and from the start. Now, let's finally consider the arguments that have emerged or re-emerged around the notion of a managerial class. This PMC thesis can be traced back to World War II, specifically to James Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution. Managerialism, as explained by James Burnham, hinges on the belief that capitalism and the rule of a managing elite are fundamentally at odds with each other. That is, that capitalism could be replaced by competent managers. Burnham assumes that capitalist production is aimed at creating wealth rather than value based on abstract labor time. Following this, he assumes that capitalism relies on a free market and will cease if the market is distorted by the power of the state. Likewise, Burnham argued that capitalism relies on a functional and confident entrepreneurial bourgeois ideology of competition. But as Marx explains in Capital, capitalism is in fact the self-contradiction of bourgeois society. Put another way, bourgeois society is defined by the way it constantly undermines and distorts itself. It is always possible for people holding with the wrong theories to make true enough observations. For example, in a recent essay by Malcolm Kean entitled Against the Managers, he notices that calls to replace cops with social workers is a good example of the managerial mindset of progressive liberals. However, what the right-wingers following after Burnham, people like Malcolm, can't grasp is such progressive policies create unintended consequences as they rely on the always contradictory process of capitalist production. Burnham, Malcolm, and even leftists like Marcuse might imagine that the managerial elite creates a controlled society filled with sheep who are lulled into sleep by liberal pieties, religious dogmas, or consumerism. But regardless of the policies of the managers, regardless of what policies they enact, another crisis, another uprising is always just around the corner. The so-called Marxists who are pushing Lin's notion that there is a new class war are not Marxists. They are not talking about class, and they are not to be trusted by socialists who still long to develop a politics of emancipation.
You're much more likely to get a diploma if one or both of your parents had diplomas, which are kind of the new degrees of nobility.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.